Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to the February edition of our 2020 Cornerstone webinars. My name is Justin Goddard, and I serve as a Program Officer for National Leadership and Education here at Community Progress. Cornerstone is our monthly webinar series that equips participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's Cornerstone, we are joined by Kim Graziani, who serves as Vice President and Director of National Technical Assistance here at Community Progress. In her role, Kim oversees, coordinates, and helps deliver a diverse range of technical assistance and capacity building services to communities across the country. Prior to joining the Community Progress team, Kim spent several years working for the City of Pittsburgh and was instrumental in developing strategies for the productive reuse of vacant and abandoned properties that prioritize authentic community engagement, neighborhood preservation, and created wealth-building opportunity for some of the city's most vulnerable residents. Before turning it over to Kim, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your browser and send it to both the webinar host and all presenters. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat box to message the Community Progress host or send an email to jgoddard@communityprogress.net. And with that, I will turn it over to Kim.
Thanks, Justin, and welcome to everyone who is joining us for today's webinar on land banking and equitable development. As Justin mentioned, my name is Kim, and I really want to thank each of you for taking the time to be with us today. As Justin mentioned, I have some background in local government, but also in a variety of other roles, and I always like to know the framework for how people approach these issues. And I am a social worker by training and quickly realized in working with one-on-one with many folks that there is such an impact of people's environments on who they are. And so while I really enjoyed that one-on-one work, I also quickly realized that I really wanted to work on more macro level issues and policies and really improve neighborhood housing conditions. So without further ado, let's jump right into things. So as you can see here, this is our outline for today. So we're going to talk a little bit about the way Community Progress and our approach, how it centers on equity and specifically racial equity. We're going to do a little bit of an overview on land banking, sort of the what, how, and why to make sure we all have a common platform. We're then going to kind of take a step back and, given our work across the country with the majority of land banks, provide a little bit of some key takeaways and some common pitfalls to avoid, with also some examples, tangible examples. We're then going to go into thinking through the future of land banking and what is on the horizon. And then last but not least, and most importantly, we're going to talk to you all. And so as Justin said, please, please, please submit questions as you have them, and I will do my best to answer as many as possible, and for those we don't get to, we will certainly follow up. Okay, so hopefully most of you know who we are, but at the Center for Community Progress, we really recognize that the barriers that vacant and abandoned properties present to creating more equitable neighborhoods and communities, from the loss of equity in a family's home that happens to be located on a block with vacant and abandoned properties, to the public health, safety, psychological impacts of folks walking by these signs of disinvestment on a daily basis and really feeling as though no one cares for them. And through our various program areas and the broad reach, as you'll see, to where we work on a yearly basis, we remain steadfast and focused on systems level change, which does make our work unique and quite honestly makes our work quite challenging at times, because we recognize that the problems associated with vacancy and abandonment are deeply entrenched and require a willingness from local governments and residents alike to change the status quo. So we also recognize that vacancy and abandonment was not created overnight, nor is it unintentional. There's a long history of racialized policies and practices that have greatly contributed to the challenges we see today. And many times those neighborhoods that are most concentrated in vacancy and abandonment are also predominantly communities of color. And most of that disinvestment can be directly related to some of these policies and practices that you see on your screen. From race-based zoning to redlining, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, the denial of mortgages based on the percentage of people of color that live in that neighborhood. Many times when we get invited to a community, we will take the redlining maps, which are easily accessible these days, particularly from the University of Richmond, which you'll see a sample of that map on the screen, and we'll do an overlay of vacancy data. And 9 times out of 10, those same boundaries where in the 1930s decisions were made that these neighborhoods were hazardous based on people of color who live there are also those neighborhoods to this day that have the most vacancy and abandonment. So it's really important to call that out and to make sure that we address that firsthand and put an end to some of this really horrible policy that has been done. I do want to talk about urban renewal, which designated certain areas as blighted to justify the removal of many stable Black households and businesses for the sake of quote unquote redevelopment. And I wanted to call that out because that is one of the reasons that I personally tend to avoid using the word blight, given the negative implications of how it's been used in the past. So you'll really hear me talk about vacant and abandoned properties versus blighted properties. Okay, so let's get right into things. So what is a land bank? So important terms to call out when you're thinking about what a land bank is it is a public entity with a focus on a specific set of properties that are causing a community harm to support local community goals. Again, public, focus, specific subset of properties causing harm to support local community goals. There are approximately 200 land banks across the country, and most of these land banks have been formed based on state enabling legislation. And although the majority of land banks, as you'll see on your screen, are located east of the Mississippi and may be associated with such legacy cities as the Cleveland and the Detroits of the world, since the foreclosure crisis and the prime in 2008, we have seen a large surge in land banks across the country who have more recently experienced the negative impacts of vacancy and abandonment. So what are the key powers of land banks? At the very bare minimum, the most important powers of land banks are acquisition, disposition, and strategic reuse. And while any entity can be called a land bank, or any program can be called a land banking program, the most effective land banks have special powers that are granted by state or local government. And some of these special powers include acquiring vacant and abandoned property through the enforcement of delinquent taxes ahead of the private speculative market. And why is this important? You know, tax delinquency coupled with vacancy and abandonment is one of the telltale signs of property that is in serious decline, and if not already, is going to cause an incredible amount of harm to a community. The ability to extinguish liens and get clear, marketable, insurable title on property, One of the biggest obstacles many communities face is that many of these vacant and abandoned properties are stuck, and they're simply not desirable to the private market because many times they are upside down in value, so that the debt and the cost for improvements to get a certificate of occupancy, or maybe the demolition that needs to be done, is much more than the assessed or fair market value of that property. So the ability of a land bank to act swiftly to stabilize that property and get that property back into responsible ownership is critical. Most land banks are tax exempt, their properties are tax exempt while in their inventory. And this is important for a few reasons, one of which is that land banks incur a lot of costs while holding property, right? They are as responsible as everyone else for maintaining and securing that property while that property is in their inventory. Special powers, funding powers are present in a lot of the state enabling legislation we see across the country. And essentially, it creates a mechanism for a land bank to generate revenue, which we'll get into a little bit in a moment. And last but not least, the authority to dispose or sell properties subject to the local community goals and missions of that land bank, rather than having to sell based on the highest bidder or maybe influenced by local politics or potentially a cumbersome bureaucratic process. A land bank is really created to still hold a lot of accountability for who they sell the property to, but to make it so that it really is according to a local community's goals. So many times we get confusion over what a land bank is versus a community land trust or, let's say, redevelopment authority. So we've created what I consider a quick cheat sheet that shows the differences between these entities, but also serves to show that they are actually complementary in nature. So most of the differences can be found in the legal structure and the mission and how long these entities want to hold on to properties and what are their authorities for disposing of properties. So for the sake of time for today, I just want to call out a few of these differences. So missions. Probably no surprise to anyone on the webinar that missions differ across each of these entities. Many times we find that community land trusts are really focused on essentially acquiring, maintaining, and stewarding property for a long term, many times in support of lasting affordability. Other times, we see some land banks also prioritize affordable housing, but they also may have other community goals that they have designated as a priority. Acquisition powers, again, land banks and redevelopment authorities generally have broader acquisition powers than community land trusts, although land banks do not have eminent domain powers. Land banks are usually focused, as I mentioned, on those properties causing the most harm and really supporting stabilization. And many RDAs or redevelopment authorities are focused on economic development and revitalization. And, not always, but tend to acquire large plots of land for immediate housing and commercial development opportunities. The tenure of ownership is also quite different. So many community land trusts, again, they acquire, they own, and they steward land permanently for community good. Whereby land banks and RDAs generally are focused on selling the property to responsible owners as soon as possible. And last but not least, disposition powers. They differ with land banks generally having the most flexibility in terms of who they can dispose to or sell to, while redevelopment authorities usually have, not always, but somewhat of a cumbersome process that may be seen as a deterrent to some potential buyers. For example, a resident that's looking to acquire the adjacent property for a side lot may not go forward with acquiring a property through an RDA if they do have to go through a 15 to 20 page application process. So when is a land bank the right tool? It is so important to identify the problem and to determine whether a land bank is the right solution. We see so many communities create land banks without a clear understanding of what they actually want that land bank to address. So, and they also create a land bank and have this expectation that it's going to solve all of a community's issues, which is not correct, and it really focuses resources in the wrong direction. So a common example we see is a community will call us and say they want us to help them create a land bank, but in fact, what they really need is better housing and building code enforcement tools to prevent properties from going into decline. On the screen as well are some other common triggers we see of which communities do create land banks. So how are land banks funded? They are funded in a variety of ways, although the most effective land banks have some level of dedicated funding. So funding sources can be from state, local, federal government sources. We all know some federal government sources these days are not as predictable as they were before. I'll leave it at that. They could come from philanthropy, land sales, providing in-kind services, acting as a co-developer and receiving fees. Most land bank legislation permits a land bank to receive funding from what we call a tax recapture, which essentially means that every property the land bank puts back on the tax rolls, they are able to receive a portion of those property taxes for a certain number of years. Granted, all of the local taxing bodies need to agree to this recapture, so usually that is the local government, the county government, the school district. But the rationale behind that is that but for the land bank, these properties would still be tax delinquent and still would be costing local government money in the way of public safety services, having to board up these properties, you name it. So sharing a small percentage of future tax revenue gives the land bank greater flexibility to stabilize more properties. In a similar vein, but more so in terms of the dedicated funding, states like Ohio have created legislative mechanisms for land banks to receive a dedicated portion of delinquent property taxes that are collected on an annual basis. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. So now we're going to take a look at what's happening nationally. And really what we're going to focus on is what are some of the key elements of success that we have found to be common across the majority of land banks across the country, and really what are those common pitfalls that we want you all to avoid, whether you currently are in a community or working in a land bank, or you're thinking about creating a land bank in the near future. So again, as part of our work with the majority of land banks, we've developed, again, a quick snapshot of what we think are some of the most common elements of success. So the most effective land banks are able to quickly and cost effectively, they're able to acquire vacant and abandoned properties through the delinquent tax enforcement process. And again, stabilize those properties quickly. The worst enemy of any vacant and abandoned property is time. So again, that ability to quickly intervene is key. Land banks that are aligned with other tools and strategies are by far most effective. So again, a community that has measures in place to prevent properties from going into decline, as I mentioned before, an example is housing and building code enforcement. Those communities that prevent the land bank from becoming the repository for all of the problem properties are by far the most effective. Land banks that truly engage residents, particularly those that are most impacted by vacancy and abandonment, and prioritize their work based on community feedback and those local community goals, are by far most effective. And they're most effective as well in building relationships and really becoming a trusted community partner. And reiterating sort of my beginning comments, which really thinking through the history of racialized policies and practices, it is critically important that land banks remain highly transparent and accountable and provide ample opportunity to explain how they work and how decisions are made on a routine basis. Okay, so now let's go over the top 5 land banking pitfalls to avoid. So, mentioned this before, but again, want to reiterate it. Too many land banks are created without an understanding of the problem at hand. So any community who is thinking about a land bank or already has one should be consistently taking stock of those properties that are causing the most harm and evaluating how a land bank in alignment with other tools can actually be a solution. One example of a land bank that has an excellent data system and a really good understanding of the problem that it's tackling is the Cuyahoga County Land Bank in Ohio, which is where the city of Cleveland is located. And their property profile system, you know, does a whole bunch of stuff, but it integrates real-time city, county, state, federal data. It actually is able to do a predictive analysis of which properties may be coming into the land bank inventory. And it is also public-facing, which knowledge is key, as all of you know, and the ability for not just a land bank to have access to this information, but to also have residents have access to this information, I think really balances some of those power dynamics. So every land bank must be transparent and flexible, and their goals have to be developed based on what is happening on the ground. As you can see here, there's a whole variety of goals and strategies, and these are just a small sampling of maybe some of the most common we see with land banks. But the bottom line is the goals and strategies have to be revisited on a regular basis and have to be communicated clearly with the public. So one example, as you'll see here, is let's say one of the land bank's goals is to support affordable housing. Then a likely strategy would be to work collaboratively with a community land trust or an affordable housing developer to plan for acquisition and sell that property for the lowest price. An example of a land bank that has really spent considerable time developing a website that is public-facing and transparent and interactive is the Albany County Land Bank in New York. It is important to note that websites and online sources of information cannot be the only way a land bank creates transparency. Obviously, there is a digital divide that is very omnipresent in many of the communities we work in. So, common pitfall or mistake number 3, the myth of self-financing. So many land banks start off, in my opinion, with false expectations of becoming self-sufficient in so many years. And while all land banks should operate in an effective, efficient, equitable strategy or fashion, they are focused on properties that have decades of neglect, right? There is significant cost associated with the rehabilitation, with dealing with the tax liens, with all of the other encumbrances that, again, outweigh the fair market or assessed value of these properties. Again, there is a reason why these properties are not desirable from the private market. Therefore, success cannot happen overnight, and it will cost money. However, it is also important to keep in mind that land banks do generate economic returns, right? Again, it does help stabilize the equity of adjacent homeowners. It does save local governments money, again, public safety, boarding costs, all of that. So there is definitely a give and take in that regard. So going back to Ohio and kind of the best practice in dedicated land bank funding. So they basically have what's called a AD Tack, which is a delinquent tax assessment collection, which was included in their state's land bank legislation from 2009. And it essentially, it allows land banks to receive 5% of the delinquent property taxes on an annual basis. So that includes the principal amount, the penalties, and interest. Now, granted, that 5% has to be approved by the county treasurer, and there is a max of how much money can go to that land bank on a yearly basis, which I believe is still maxed at $7 million per year. But as you can see, $7 million a year, which does go to Cuyahoga County Land Bank, that is a significant chunk of money. And think about how much better a land bank is able to plan and really be a good partner in a community, knowing that they're going to get that amount of money on an annual basis. I should say, let me go back one second, I should also say that many states have not been successful in authorizing or legislating this type of dedicated funding. So I would be remiss if I didn't also point out that there's a wonderful example of a land bank in the southwestern Pennsylvania called the Tri-Cog Land Bank that essentially has over 30 members, so municipalities, school districts, the county, and they've all signed on to a memorandum whereby they voluntarily dedicate 5% of their delinquent tax revenue to the land bank on a yearly basis. So again, the example from Ohio is a legislative strategy. The example from the Tri-Cog Land Bank in the southwestern Pennsylvania is truly an engagement and a voluntary basis strategy, which is also quite effective. So common mistake number 4. I don't like to admit this all the time, but I will say that there are still several land banks that simply do not acknowledge the past practices and histories and impacts of public entities acquiring properties in the name of quote unquote blight removal. And while these conversations may be uncomfortable for some and quite frankly simply exhausting for others who live with these racial injustices on a daily basis, land banks have a responsibility to address these and to authentically engage people in these communities, and particularly making sure that communities where they are actually acquiring these properties, they cannot be done in a silo and not actually be able to be transparent and work with the residents in that community. An example of a land bank that has really done, I would say, a stellar job at community engagement is the Lucas County Land Bank. Again, in Ohio, but in Toledo, Ohio. And they have actually been able to hire a full-time director that's dedicated to this work. And while some land banks may not have the resources, right, to hire somebody, I think what's most important is that they are authentic and honest in how they engage and the follow-up and the promises they make to any given community. So last but not least, we have seen too many land banks try to be all things to all people. And what they end up doing is they do all things quite poorly. So the most successful land banks recognize that there are key areas of expertise that are needed, and they cannot all be housed within a land bank. So instead, partnerships must be forged with fire and police and elected officials and housers and environmental justice advocates, you name it. A land bank really cannot go it alone. One particular partnership opportunity that we really wanted to discuss and talk about is a really exciting emerging area of partnership between land banks and community land trusts. For the past few years, Community Progress has partnered with Grounded Solutions Network to explore and support the creation of a pipeline of vacant and abandoned properties for lasting affordable housing. And what is really interesting about this is that it actually addresses some of the top challenges for both land banks and community land trusts. So, for example, a common challenge for land banks is finding responsible end users that are aligned with community goals. Well, on the same hand, a CLT's common challenge is the ability to acquire property that's cost effective. So utilizing a land bank's legal powers to acquire these properties cost effectively and transfer the CLT is kind of a no-brainer. We have not seen all that many partnerships take place across the country. We do see some growing interest. On the map here, you'll see a few different communities that are highlighted. This is certainly not exhaustive of all the land bank CLT partnerships, but these are some of the folks that we have been in touch with. One of the key takeaways from these land bank CLT partnerships is, you know, and this really goes for a lot of partnerships per se, but number one, both entities really have to reach consensus on their goals and their target geography. And, you know, every partnership has to discuss how this will not only align with, but complement each organization's mission. And also important is to recognize, you know, this myth that, you know, some of the weakest markets where land banks have their inventory they're not in need of quality, affordable housing. And we have seen that not to be true. We've also seen examples of land banks collaboratively plan with their local CLTs to acquire property in neighborhoods that are more stable in nature, but are also in need of quality, affordable housing options. 2, partnerships must be grounded in honesty and transparency, and therefore discussions must ensue about challenges, constraints, and quite frankly, their tolerance for risk. An example is thinking through the impacts of a land bank selling property to a CLT for a discount for the sake of providing affordable housing versus selling a property to the highest bidder. That will obviously have some financial implications. However, this is also a unique advantage of a land bank to truly embrace the fact that it is a mission-driven entity. We've seen partnerships that really do not engage in what I call analysis paralysis. While I think everyone needs to really think through these things, we can get caught up in trying to think through every single challenge and issue. And the bottom line is sometimes you just got to select a few properties and test it out. Create a pilot program to really think through, you know, what the kinks are, build trust among both entities, and to assess how and whether a more formalized partnership may proceed. So all in all, we're super excited about this emerging opportunity and really see great value to support these types of land bank and CLT partnerships, really to ensure that there are more inclusive and equitable neighborhoods across the country. So moving forward, so let's say everyone on this call who doesn't have a land bank is completely thrilled and enthralled with everything that I've talked about today and is super excited to create a land bank. These are a few key points to check off your list as you continue your discussion. So again, really think through what your target inventory is, and do you need state or local legislation to get additional special powers? Reach out to your partners early and often. Make sure that there are other systems in place to prevent properties from ultimately going into a land bank inventory. And also continuing to revisit and challenge yourselves about what success looks like and for whom is this land bank benefiting. So what we are seeing, if we had the magic ball, we see land bank evolving into what we hope will be more states and communities that have dedicated funding streams. We've seen a lot more interest of people sort of revisiting their land bank laws and trying to get dedicated funding legislated, similar to what Ohio has done. We've also seen, land banks have growing inventories of vacant land. And land banks really embracing the role that they can play in creating more resilient communities through stormwater management, urban agriculture, you name it. More land banks are truly embracing the role they can play in becoming a repository of properties, both before and after natural disasters, which, again, in this day and age, we really do need to prioritize that, since unfortunately, I'm not sure that those disasters are going to dissipate anytime soon. We've talked about this, but more land banks truly embracing the need to partner with CLTs, affordable housing developers, to support more inclusive and equitable communities. And last but not least, we've seen more land banks be able to focus their resources and evaluate their impacts and outcomes. One example of that, and I encourage you all to take a look at our website, is we've done a lot of work in the state of New York, and through a very large investment made through the New York Attorney General's office, there was a case study done on New York land banks across the state over a 3-year period. And as you'll see here from the slide, it tells quite a good story about the amount of investment and that's been leveraged, the increase in assessed value, new tax revenue, increase in sales proceeds, you name it. So I encourage you all to take a look at that. So my final challenge to you all before we get into the question and answer session is, we have a history of racist land policy that has left our communities segregated and incredibly inequitable across neighborhoods. We have systemic poverty, and we have a racialized wealth gap. We have housing justice as a universal demand that's coming from every corner of the country, from owners and renters, and affordability and tenant protections that are becoming in place. And we have this thing called climate change. And while all of those present some very, very major challenges, the one thing that connects them all is land. And land is wealth, land is power, land is liberation. And who has access to it, who owns it, who decides how it's used? Land banks probably never assumed that they could play such a pivotal role in advancing equity, but they do. And that's a huge challenge, that's an immense responsibility, and quite frankly, it's an awesome privilege. So we stand ready to support all of you in meeting that challenge, and we're going to try our best to do that each and every day. So it is now discussion time. So I am going to put you all on just a brief hold. We're going to collect the questions that have been submitted thus far. And again, please, anyone who hasn't submitted a question, please do so at this time. Okay, so we are going to jump in. Again, please keep your questions coming. So one question is, can land banks be formed without state enabling legislation? And the answer is yes. Particularly with communities that have local home rule powers. We've seen places like Cook County in Illinois, they don't have state enabling legislation. However, they've created a land bank at the county level that essentially has the same authority as local government. We've also seen communities simply create land banking programs within local government, and or land banks be created that are simply akin to a nonprofit or an LLC. Where we think there is special value in getting state enabling legislation, again, is to really go back to those special powers that I talked about at the beginning of the webinar, which is making sure that a land bank has the ability to intervene and to acquire properties through the tax enforcement process and to get clear title. to be able to have a lot of flexibility in terms of disposing of properties, to get specific revenue sources. And one thing I didn't mention, but I do think it's important to note, is that most of the legislation that we've had the privilege of being part of, we have made sure that as part of the governance structure, there is some mandate to have community representation. So short answer is yes. I think it's really a matter of each community to think through, do they need additional special powers to really address their target problem inventory? Okay, next question, great question. Is there a role for land banks in a city where vacant and abandoned properties are scarce and where gentrification is running rampant? I would say yes. I have yet to be in any city, and even I would say the stronger market cities that we think of, where there isn't some level of disinvestment, right? These racialized policies and practices did not just happen in weak market cities, right? They've happened all across the country. And again, I think the real question is depending on the scale of vacancy and abandonment, what makes the most sense in terms of an entity to address that? Can it just be that a local government can take a more proactive role in acquiring those vacant and abandoned properties? Does it make sense for a land bank to be created? We have examples of land banks across the country where they have literally one staff person or maybe even a half-time staff person. They are technically housed within local government, but they do have some dedicated resources whereby they may only acquire a handful or two handfuls of vacant and abandoned properties per year. But for the legal powers that a land bank has, they really would not be able to acquire those properties as quickly and as cost effectively. Also, in areas where gentrification really is an issue, again, this really drills home the importance and the opportunity for a land bank to really create that pipeline of properties for an entity like a community land trust or another entity in a community that is truly focused on creating affordable housing. One of the things that, again, I'm sure most of you are aware of on this call and this webinar is, you know, community land trusts do hold that land affordable for permanent. So many times they will hold the actual land for 99 years, and it's essentially dual ownership, right? So a CLT homeowner will buy the improvement or the structure, but the CLT will actually own that land. And so that actually ensures that that land will still be affordable for generations to come. Okay, question, why are there not more land banks in the West, especially in places like California? I don't know. I can't quite answer that for you, with the exception that I think I can give you some anecdotal thoughts that, again, you can take it or leave it. So I think sometimes there is the thought that places in the West have stronger markets and they do not need a land bank. I think there's also some complications with some of the tax laws in a place like California or potentially Oregon that make it a little bit more challenging. I also think just based on the history of vacancy and abandonment in the Northeast, in the Midwest, and in the Southeast, it's simply that idea of creating an entity to really address these properties simply has a longer track record here. We have been so pleased that we have gotten more requests for support from communities west of the Mississippi, and we certainly continue to keep our doors open for more communities to approach us and that we can hopefully work with them to figure out, again, if a land bank is the right strategy. Okay, how do I know if we have state enabling legislation for land banking? Are there examples of city-led land banks? So how do you know if you have state enabling legislation for land banking? Depending on the state you're in, most state legislatures have an online database where you could do keyword searches to see whether there is legislation that matches those keywords. You could also cheat like I do as a non-lawyer, is I call one of my lawyer colleagues and ask whether they know of whether there's legislation for a given state. And they also have access to a few different legal databases that's a little bit quicker. And your second question of whether there are examples, let's see, of city-led land banks. Yes, I would say if you take a look at our land bank headquarters, which is on our website, and my last slide will actually give you the link, I would say there's quite a few of land banks that are led by a city government and are based on a city jurisdiction. So an example, gosh, I can give you a few examples. In Evansville, Indiana, their redevelopment authority has basically created a land bank, so that would consider that a city-led land bank. In terms of just the geography of whether a land bank works at a county level or a multi-county level or a city level or a municipal level, generally speaking, we recommend land banks to work in a geography that aligns with the collection of delinquent taxes, right? So, for example, I live in Baltimore City. Delinquency or collection of delinquent taxes happens at the city level, which makes it a little bit easier, right? If they were to create a land bank, they actually are working in an area where all of that delinquent taxes are collected. I will say, however, there's many county land banks across the country, and they simply have that MOU or agreement with their school district and with their local government, again, to make sure that they do have access to that inventory. And to be quite honest, that there is some alignment with what the land bank is doing that goes across multiple jurisdictions. Okay, let's see. Somebody asked, what is a CLT? So a CLT is, and I encourage you when we send the slides, you can definitely go back to one of them, but essentially a CLT is a private nonprofit. Generally speaking, is governed by what we call a tripartite board, which is made up of homeowners, community stakeholders, as well as generally public officials or government representatives. Their mission is to support long-term community good. And the way they do that, which I think really makes them unique, is that they're focused on acquiring, owning, and stewarding land for a longer term period, usually 99 years. So while not all community land trusts are solely focused on affordable housing, many of the ones that we work with through our partner at Grounded Solutions is focused on affordable housing. And again, they keep ownership of the actual land, which is definitely a pretty big difference than what a land bank or a redevelopment is. I also encourage you to reach out to our partners at Grounded Solutions Network. They have some incredible resources on their website for CLTs, and I am certainly not an expert on CLTs, so I hope they won't be mad at me with the way that I'm describing them. Are there good examples of land bank CLT collaborations or programming? Sure, there are, and I would like to emphasize again that this is an emerging area of opportunity. So I'd say that right now we are actively working with a few different communities. So one I would say is Albany, New York, and we actually have a report on our website that talks about some of the work we did with the Albany County Land Bank and the Albany Community Land Trust. And the one example, the reason why I bring them up is because they're a good example of how they've created a partnership on multiple levels. So one is they have actually entered into an MOU, which, as most of you know, it's not necessarily a legal binding document, but it is a document that really puts both organizations' best foot forward in being intentional about partnering with each other. Two, they have actually created a program of the land bank, which is called the Inclusive Neighborhoods Program. And what they did is the land bank and the CLT put their heads together and actually collaboratively determined which neighborhoods across Albany, the city of Albany, are in the greatest need of affordable housing. So again, these are the neighborhoods that typically I would say are more stable or, stronger market neighborhoods, for lack of a better term, which you can imagine would pose a lot of challenges for the land bank, since those might be those neighborhoods where if they sell a property, they could probably get the largest financial return. So by designating specific neighborhoods, the land bank basically said that of those properties that come into its inventory, based on their board approval, that they will give the CLT a first look at those properties in those targeted neighborhoods. They will also, consider a discount for the sale of those properties to the CLT, which I think is really an exciting opportunity. I think there are other examples across the country. For the sake of time, Richmond, Virginia, which essentially is a land bank that actually houses a CLT program within their organization, which is an interesting model. I'd say Atlanta, Georgia is also another example. They've been at this for quite some time, where they have essentially both leaders of the land bank and the CLT have really created a solid relationship. They don't necessarily have a formal written agreement, but they do have quite a good example of a really build trust between both of those leaders, and the land bank has transferred quite a few properties and has also advocated on behalf of the CLT to get the subsidy and capital that is obviously needed to truly create affordable housing. So it is 12:56. I am going to answer one more question, which is so difficult to do because there's so many good ones. Okay, I will end it with this. Can you provide any information examples of land banks, let's see here, that are aligned with other strategies? So I guess I would just point to what I mentioned earlier, which is there is a few land banks that I won't mention by name that truly have become the repository of every single problem property in that neighborhood, which is not sustainable. And so again, I think those communities where, in addition to creating a land bank, they've invested resources in being much more proactive and strategic in housing and building code enforcement, so making sure that properties do not go into decline. Also creating equitable delinquent tax enforcement mechanisms, which is another key preventative mechanism. Again, while land banks are generally focused on vacant and abandoned properties, once a building goes into physical decline and then it becomes tax delinquent, it's almost a surefire way of that property ultimately going into the hands of a land bank or simply just causing a heck of a lot of harm and cost to a local community. So being able to work out hardship plans and be much more proactive in identifying owners before those delinquent taxes become way unbearable is incredibly important. So I am going to stop there. And Justin, did you want to come back on and to provide a few closing remarks?
Sure. I'll just go ahead and wrap us up for the afternoon. And I first want to thank Kim for giving an excellent presentation, and I want to thank everybody for joining us. I hope that you'll join us on March 26th for our next Cornerstone webinar, and please be sure to visit our website for more information on this and other upcoming webinars and events. And with that, I hope you all have a great afternoon.